Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the 2002 film Rollerball. So, really, for a lot of people that might know this movie or may be familiar with it, or some people that have never heard of this in their life, which is perfectly fine, this movie is to be able to be seen right here and now on HBO Max. Kind of really a fascinating film. I really actually do enjoy it. We have a number of celebrities that are also in this movie. Like, we end up having the band Slipknot. We end up having, of course, Pink as some kind of stock footage being used in this movie. We end up having Paul Heyman, who is, I guess, the American or English announcer within this film. We end up having Shane McMahon, who ends up showing up briefly within this movie. Yeah, there is kind of quite a bit of celebrities and kind of bit of interesting things going on here. The reason why I have to say that this is Rollerball 2002, because some people may not know at all that there was a previous Rollerball with James Caan in it. I remember that movie fairly well because I think what ended up happening to James Caan's best friend was that he ended up having to go to the hospital because he ended up becoming a vegetable. And then James Caan had to seek revenge on the team of which that he is going up against because uh, of what had happened to his friend. I think what happens in that original movie. Going on into this film, have a we have not only a sport, but we also have an economy. We end up finding out that it seems that Alex Petrosh is a owner of this sport, but it seems that he is also a owner of his environment, of his like his influence goes further beyond just buying this sport. It seems like he owns people that are to be a part of anyone's life within this team, so that way he can kind of manipulate people to do what he wants because he pays them pretty well. So, going on into this movie, I'm not going to go into huge specifics about this film, but I am kind of go over the most important parts of it because really I feel that I really do enjoy this movie, but like I don't want to go into heavily like what exactly every single team's name are. More than likely, I might just go with the IMD approach where it just says red team or gold team or blue team or whatever. But I'm going to try to like skip over a lot of the specifics within this movie and get to the real meat and the bones of everything. Going into this movie, I do really enjoy the fact that it seems that we end up having us kind of uh, eventually having like the wool draped over us through a good portion of this movie, where it just seems like it's just going to be a movie about a sport and that's it. And eventually they're going to escalate that sport, but then no, we eventually realize that there is something really and truly going on here. We end up finding out that these people that are orchestrating this show are really trying to push the ratings or trying to desperately try to get an American deal. And we really eventually find out that it seems that we have also a lot of times where a lot of these player stories are heavily fabricated to where we end up getting a backstory of these people of being a rodeo rider or rodeo player or whichever, which isn't exactly true. We end up having it to where really a lot of times we end up having people desperately trying to confirm these people's backstories, and we end up having a character like Marcus, who is LL Cool J, going like, dude, are you seriously gonna like actually tell me that and ask me that? Like, no, there is no way my mother is that at all. So really we have it to where like this sport is almost as fabricated or as unreal as really any kind of other like professional sport that has a storyline to try to get you to invest in their players, their characters, their however you want to melt it down, their athletes. which I thought was fascinating. To kind of look at Paul Heyman, who is doing the American announcing, let's just say, of this movie, it is kind of funny when he used to look at other announcers that are to start spouting out this like nonsensical stuff that Paul Heyman is just baffled by. Is just kind of hilarious to me when we see Paul Heyman looking at other announcers that are spouting out nonsense about sex stuff, and he's like, "What? like what are they trying to promote here? Like, what are they trying to do?" Really, eventually, we have this be simply a game where you need to put a ball uh, into a thing of sorts, where we end up having it to where we end up having to take this giant ball and smack it into some like silverish or goldish or whatever looking pan, and that is to set off a score. A silverish or goldish pan that is like kind of propped up on some portion of uh, this hockey looking arena of sorts, to where we end up having this like hockey inside setup, but inside it's very much like a parkour skating ramp like situation. So going on into here, eventually this TV show is desperate to try and get ratings. So we end up having, of course, us being reminded of shows like The Running Man, or eventually like shows, or eventual movies like Bloodsport and stuff like that, to where it's not just enough that these people have to play this game. There has to be a gruesome, violent edge to it. And so that's what is to intrigue people, and eventually that's what's to captivate an audience, to push on to seemingly have people interested consistently within the show, because we end up finding out that it seems that cameras are trying to watch over certain people. Cameras are trying to focus on certain things, and eventually we'll find out later why was that, because that part is really important. There was some kind of setup within these matches, and it like was very bizarre how that came about. So with that said, I thought that this movie was really, really fun, because I liked the desperation of it. I like eventually when we get to where these players are realizing that enough is enough and that they need to try to escape out of here, and we'll see where that goes. And the only thing that I honestly don't like about this film is when we have that whole entire night scene where they have to go into like a night vision like lens so that way you can be able to see anything, or you just wouldn't be able to see anything. Like, I wish they could have figured out some kind of lighting system, something to where you could see what is going on within that scene, instead of relying on a night vision like thing. That kind of like, to me, that is probably the most disappointing thing about this movie, is like, man, they could not have like figured out some way to light this environment correctly. They couldn't have figured out how to follow after these people with some kind of lighting mechanism. And plus, also, you couldn't exactly see what's going on through some of these scenes. You can just kind of see lights and whatever, but you couldn't exactly tell what's going on. And plus, too, there were some kind of big budget things that they put in here to where I was just like, man, like, and they're doing this with like a night vision lens. Okay. But other than that, I think I really want to get into specifics about this, because reasonably, I thought this movie was fun. I have seen all kinds of different style movies like this. I've seen the Dean Cain movie Future Sport, which is kind of similar to this. I've also seen the original Rollerball, and eventually maybe I'll, if this movie does well, maybe I'll go back and reviewing that one. Really, I've also kind of just seen all kind of goofy like. I really want to I really want to try and find like a sports movie that isn't the normal like sports film, to where we end up having it to be like a real fight to the death kind of thing, where I think that's why I enjoyed movies like Arena or just eventually like some kind of uh, even like the original Arena movie, the older one, where we eventually have some boxer having to fight aliens for a living. That movie. But anyways, so I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers about this movie. Again, not gonna go into heavy details, but I'm just gonna try to like talk about this movie as best as I can, because there is quite a bit of like actual like matches and stuff going on. Some arena ball things going on, and that's going to be probably the most difficult thing. But the good thing that I like about this movie is that they try to leave it all on the actual rollerball court, or the rollerball thing, the rollerball game, which I really do appreciate, because they really could have just had rollerball being a clickbaiting thing to get people in here and watch this and whatever, but they didn't do that. They focused a lot on the rollerball, to where they tried to do a lot of things different, which I applaud them for, and I like the fact that they did that. So, with that said, let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we immediately have Jonathan Cross, who is to in the very beginning of this movie, he is to try to do extreme sports to be able to make a living, because it seems that he is not able to be picked up for any HL or NHL hockey teams. So in the very beginning of this, we end up having a beginning sequence where Jonathan Cross and some other guy are doing this thing called street lunge, or street lunges, or street lunging. Really, some people might be familiar with the Olympic sport of that, lunging. But also, I guess there is also street lunging, which I guess at some points could either be legal or be illegal, depending on where you do this at. Like, I was kind of fascinated that I could figure out how exactly what this sport was, because I had no clue what actually the name of it was. Luckily, on the end credit scene of the movie Yes Man, there is a lunge scene in there where I was like, oh, thank God! Like, I remember that movie, so I can remember what this sport was, because I didn't know. So going on to this, so we end up having Jonathan, who is eventually going into actually traffic with this other lunger. And so we eventually have it to where there seems to be motorcycles with cameras following them and trying to see who eventually wins. So these two cats are eventually going into seemingly public streets to eventually go and do this sport, and eventually we end up having almost Jonathan almost ending up getting killed, and then eventually we end up having almost the other lunger almost getting like killed as well. But eventually Jonathan ends up kicking him away to eventually have this other lunger like being like tossed out in through some building. We end up eventually having it to where Marcus Ridley is, I guess, just so happened to be driving by, to eventually see that there seems to be some kind of cops that are appearing to stop these people from lunging. So we end up having Marcus, who ends up opening his car door to eventually have Jonathan jump into his vehicle to eventually have them escape. We eventually have Marcus, who is doing some kind of catch up thing with Jonathan. Like, hey man, like, why are you doing this extreme sport kind of thing? Like, aren't you getting picked up by NHL? And Jonathan's like, no, like, man, like, I'm having a difficult time, like, picking something up. And we end up having it to where Jonathan is like, well, hey, yeah, are you still like doing like, are you still doing like rollerball or whatever? And we end up having Marcus, who's like, yeah, like it's a real lucrative deal. If anything, hey man, like come with me, and like you'll see if they'll be able to like want to pick you up and stuff like that. If anything, like over there, they actually really love Americans, and like you're a white boy, of course, so like that'll probably work in your favor. So we end up immediately having, of course, a us to be basically saying that, of course, Jonathan is perfect for rollerball, and so we end up having him, of course, going on to eventually be a seemingly like a starter or a very important key member of this team. And it seems that we end up having Paul Heyman, who ends up trying to make it to this arena. But it seems that there's a ton of lines at this arena, so we end up having because Paul Heyman doesn't actually have a name in this movie. He's just English, or he's just American announcer. So we end up having Paul Heyman making his way to the arena. It seems like he is severely jet lagged and whatever, to the point of him just kind of like really just dusting off the dust and sleep and whatever, because he's just so exhausted. So we end up having us go along to eventually see that not only Paul Heyman is doing some announcing in this movie, but there are also several other announcers that are in this show, where we end up having like a wide variety of like absurd kind of announcers doing all these kinds of announcing, so on and so forth. But we end up having it to where we end up having Paul, who is ending up getting fed a brand new storyline of Jonathan, that he is some rodeo rider. And so we end up having now Paul having to spew out this garbage, because we end up having it to where these people are to tell us all kinds of stories about what had happened to any number of people, or they are to tell us any like biopics or whatever of these certain characters that aren't, in all honesty, really true. So we have Jonathan, who ends up going into this matchup, and so we end up having Jonathan, who is, of course, a person that does not seemingly care to wear his spine protector. We end up having, of course, Marcus, who is to go and grab a spine protector for Jonathan to wear. And Jonathan tells Marcus, he's like, oh, thanks, Mom. Really consistently telling us that it seems that Jonathan is consistently trying to say that he does not want to wear this spine protector, but there's probably a whole reason for that. So we end up having Jonathan, who is to start to conflict with a character named Aurora. It seems like she is to tell both Jonathan and Marcus, like, hey, like, could you guys stop with all the hot dog cowboy bullshit? And Jonathan's like, well, okay, we'll stop with the whole hot dog cowboy bullshit. Like, okay, sure, like whatever you want. Like, realistically, for these matches, it's like, who cares as long as they win. So we go on, and we end up having it to where Jonathan is to talk to one of his teammates, who is called Toba. I think that's his name. I could be wrong. Yeah, I think that his name is Toba. So we end up having Toba, who seems to be one of their guys that comes in and like tackles people. It seems like he's kind of like a defender. And so it also seems that Toba seems to also no, yeah, like who cares? Let's get past that. So we end up having Jonathan talking to Toba, and he's like, "Hey man, like give us a good shout." And it's like, and he's like, "Yeah, like good buddy." And then we end up having Toba or we end up having Jonathan and everybody going out there, and we end up having it to where it seems like there is one character that is consistently mentioning that he's the new guy in the team and no one cares. So we push on, and so we end up having Jonathan and the team going and eventually like scoring really early, and then eventually we end up having at some point Jonathan handing off the ball to Aurora for Aurora to eventually score. And then we end up having Jonathan basically giving smooches and Aurora giving the finger at some point. Like, I don't know if all these games are connected with one another, but it is what it is. So eventually, we end up having the red team coach who ends up bringing Toba out there, and so we end up having Toba who ends up taking some people down. But then eventually, we end up having Toba who ends up seemingly go and have his helmet drop to the ground, because it seems that eventually we end up finding out that Toba's helmet had its neck part like cut, so that way Toba wouldn't realize it and would just eventually lose his helmet. So we go on to eventually have Toba get up after retrieving his helmet to get careened by this rollerball to the face, to where we end up seeing Jonathan scrambling to like, dude, get a medic out there. And so we end up having it to where Toba is to go to the hospital and be carried off, and we end up having it to a reasonably, like, after the match is over, we end up having Jonathan go to the club with Marcus. Plus, there's a lot of times where we end up having both Jonathan and Marcus having to deal with press and like trying to not really give a crap about their crappy remarks. To where like Marcus is really just like, dude, take the money and shut up, kind of thing. So we end up having it to where both Jonathan and Marcus go to this club, and of course Marcus is loving the women because of course the women don't speak English that well, and he's like, that's the way I love it. We end up finding out that Marcus has a wife and a child and whatever, but it seems that he could also kind of play the field a little bit because he's on the other side of the world. So we end up having Jonathan, who is to eventually go to his teammates, and it seems that they are or they are excited, let's just say, about their victory, and they are drinking their way into their victories and stuff like that. They're grabbing beers and whatever, and we end up having it to where the team is some characters are excited about getting a tattoo of their number on their face, because I guess that means that they are going to be a permanent member of this team. And so we end up having Jonathan, who ends up asking Marcus, it's like, dude, are you ever going to get a tattoo on your face? Like, no, like, that's not going to be for us. We end up having it to where eventually the team is bringing up their glasses to have a toast for both Jonathan and Marcus for helping them with this victory. And Jonathan is like, no, like this toast needs to go for Toba. And they're like, yeah, Toba, definitely. So we end up having both Jonathan and Marcus going to Denikin, and we end up finding out that Denikin is kind of very upset. We end up having Denikin, who has his brother with him that seems to be throwing around money for drinks, and Denikin is like, no, like, dude, I'll pay for your drinks. Like I make pretty good money, and like I'm willing to to pay for your drinks. It's like, hey man, like, it's okay. So we end up having Jonathan, who's like, hey man, like, chill out, like, just enjoy the party. And we end up having Denikin going like, dude, I'm like really uneasy right now. Like, like I just found something out. So we have Denikin who ends up going and showing both Jonathan and Marcus the helmet of Toba, and they find out that it seems that the helmet of Toba was like his neck part was cut. So we end up having Jonathan who's like, dude, I'm not gonna take this lying down. I'm gonna go to the owner and I'm gonna have him see what he does. I'm gonna like make I'm gonna make Alex it seems like his name is Alexis. Alex and then IS. Petrosh. Let's go with Petrosh. We have it where Jonathan is going to go to Petrosh to try to see what he's going to do about this. So we end up having Jonathan, who is to show Petrov this helmet, and we end up having Petrov who's like, wow, like, I didn't realize that this was happening. And so we end up having Jonathan think that Petrov is going to do something about it, that he's going to call the other owners and see what the heck is going on. But of course, Petrov isn't going to do anything because he knows full well that this was going to happen. So we eventually end up having Jonathan, who ends up leaving to go off to eventually go back into the locker room where it seems that Aurora had stayed to go and work out. So it seems that eventually we end up having Aurora, who ends up taking down one of the cameras in the locker room to eventually go and jump onto Jonathan to eventually seemingly make love with him, to where eventually they are sharing a shower together. We end up having Jonathan eventually telling Aurora, like, hey, when are we actually going to do this on an actual bed? Like, when are we actually going to cement this relationship? And Aurora is like, well, like, I don't think that's ever going to happen because we need to try to make this as secret as possible. Because eventually they'll try to use this on one another. So we go on in this movie, and so we eventually have it to where it seems that Jonathan and Aurora are going on to separate vehicles, and then eventually they start to drive around town to eventually see that there is some riot eventually breaking out. Aurora goes with her motorcycle to spot what's going on beforehand, and then Jonathan is to hear that Aurora is to tell him to get out of his vehicle. So they do, and so both Jonathan and Aurora are to eventually be witness to a riot, to where eventually Jonathan's car is to eventually catch on fire. So we eventually have it to where Jonathan and Aurora are to try to make their flight for their next match. And we end up having, bizarrely, where one of Petrov's men asks Jonathan, like, hey man, is your car okay? Like, are you okay? Like, it seems like your car was last spotted in this location, and I just wanted to check that you were okay. And Jonathan suspiciously was like, dude, were you following me? And Petrov's guy is like, oh no, like I just wanted to make sure that you were okay. Like, our players are very valuable to us, and like so are their vehicles and cars and whatever. So we eventually have Jonathan, who is honestly very uneasy about all this, because why wouldn't he be? So we eventually have it to where also Aurora was to show Jonathan the playback of the tapes of this show while they were both in the spa / shower thing together. We have Aurora who showcases that Toba had 4 different cameras on him, and there was only one true real camera that was actually like focused on the real action of things. So they were like following this guy around for reasons. There was some kind of reason for it. So we go along, and so we eventually head to seemingly have it to where like Jonathan and Marcus are really like trying to talk things out, and basically it seems that more and more, like, Jonathan is getting very uneasy to where it is starting to almost make Marcus fairly uneasy. So we eventually have it to where it seems like someone is trying to take some of these players out. We end up having in the next match where it seems that they are uh, having, of course, the red team against, I believe, the gold team. So we end up having it to where it seems that there is really some uneasiness with Aurora, and so it seems that somebody is to pay off the gold team to try to take her out. We end up having it to where it seems that the one of the guys on the gold team is to cut one of Aurora's gas lines to where she is starting to leak gas. And so we end up having Aurora, who doesn't think anything of it, and jumps back onto her motorcycle to start leaking gas. Then eventually we end up having one of the gold members going and lighting this this gas. To where eventually we end up having Marcus, who is to notice that Aurora is going to eventually catch on fire. And so we end up having Marcus, who ends up grabbing onto Aurora and chucking her off her motorcycle. And we end up having Marcus, who ends up going flying from out of the ring to eventually going into the stands. We end up eventually, after this match, having to check that seemingly Marcus is going to be at practice tomorrow, and so is Jonathan. But we end up having it to where Marcus is like, dude, like, this is going way too far. Like, I am peacing out at this point. Like, we're going to get out of here. So we end up having both Marcus and Jonathan trying to sneak their way out. We end up having a bunch of the team getting together as much money as they can to give Jonathan and Marcus to sneak out of here. So we end up having Jonathan and Marcus, who ends up trying to take a vehicle, a truck of sorts, to try to get out of here. And it seems that eventually there seems to be Petrov's men who are to chase after them. We eventually have it to where Marcus and Jonathan are to try to outsmart these people by trying to go from this truck to a motorcycle that is inside this truck to eventually try and get away from these people that way. We end up having both Marcus and Jonathan who are to try to get to the border to try to hope that they can get to an American embassy so that way they can try to just get out of here, be free. Eventually, we end up having it to where it seems that there is some vehicle that Jonathan and Marcus are seeing that is really gaining on them. And like, dude, what do they have? Like, what do they have to get to us? And we end up finding out that it is some giant plane which is to dump out certain kind of vehicles and cars to eventually try to chase after Jonathan and Marcus. That's how desperate they need these players. So we end up having it to where eventually, right at the border, we end up having this bridge that is starting to now go up. And so we end up having it to where it seems that Marcus and Jonathan cannot make this jump of this bridge together to desperately make it past this border. We end up having it to where Jonathan is demanding Marcus try to go and make it because he has a family and Jonathan doesn't. And that Jonathan will try to somehow get a way out of here and everything will work out. Like, Jonathan is lying to Marcus, telling him that things will work out, which they won't. So we end up having Marcus, who is to try and make this jump of this bridge gap, and we end up having Petrov, who is watching over both his players, and we end up having Petrov, who's like, you know what, like, I want to see if he can make this bridge gap. I want to see if he can make it. We end up having Marcus, who ends up jumping the gap and making it, but sadly enough, shortly thereafter that, we end up having Petrov's men who ends up shooting this guy in the head. Also, funny enough, speaking of like wrestlers, There was a wrestler called Scotty Too Hottie that was in WWE. It seems that also that Scotty Too Hottie actually was in this film because I was kind of scrolling through here and I found out that it seems that Scotty Too Hottie, that wrestler, was actually in this movie as well. Funny enough, but anyways, so we go on and so we end up having it to where pushing on now. So we end up having it to where to where Petrov ends up going and collecting Jonathan and having him on his plane. To where Petrov is to basically tell Jonathan that he's like, "Did you really think that you would get away from me? Like, did you really think that you could try uh to like slip away?" Petrov really is to tell Jonathan like how much of resources and whatever that he really and truly owns. Like how he kind of owns players because he owns the families of which that is otherwise tied to these players. How like basically he owns everyone and so on and so forth, and there's no way for a person like Jonathan to eventually escape. Petrov is basically saying, well, hey, like, and plus also, like, you might think that you don't have anything of value that we could, keep from you, but, like, we realized that you had not only Marcus, but you ended up having Aurora as well. Believe me, we know. So, we go on eventually have it to where Jonathan is pushing Petrov to almost grab Jonathan and push him from out of this plane because we end up having Petrov who has a really short fuse. So we end up having all the other like investors that are with Petrov saying like, dude, this guy is valuable. Like we can't just let him go. We end up having also Petrov who is telling Jonathan that eventually they're going to give him some kind of like retirement match or something with that because reasonably they want to build this guy up, but eventually they are going to retire him at some point, so that way they can try to get the most value out of this guy that they've built up so well. So we end up going along, and so we eventually have Petrov who is talking to Jonathan, and it seems that Jonathan is like, you know what, like I really do want a lot of control of this company. I want to be co-owner. Uh I want to be this, I want to be that. I want to have much more control. And Jonathan is like, "Well, hey, like also like I also want to have you get rid of Aurora. She's kind of annoying me. I want you to go and trade her to some other team." Some other team, so I guess that so I guess that Jonathan could try to protect Aurora without them thinking about it. And so we end up having Petrov who's like, oh, okay, yeah, like I'll trade Aurora onto another team. Sure. And so we end up having Petrov who ends up trading Aurora to the team that Jonathan is playing against. So we end up having it forcibly to where Jonathan uh, is going to have to do this match, and it seems that coincidentally that they had decided to change the rules of this game. If the rules weren't confusing anyways, because really we end up having it to where it seems that they have to kind of go around this arena like thing, uh, this rollerball thing a couple times, and then try to score within hitting this silver pan like thing to eventually as good as they can hit this pan thing to score some point. Really, like it's very hard to talk about this rollerball thing about what the actual thing of it is, but it is what it is. So we have Jonathan and everyone noticed that it seems like the rules have changed specifically for this match. And it seems that there is a no holds barred, no disqualifications, no whichever kind of thing going on into this match. And really they're like, well, yeah, of course it is, because Jonathan is supposed to die somehow in this match, and so is also Aurora. So, like, we end up having it to where, like, Petrov is really having a couple, like, bits of his thugs that are actually out on the other gold team. And it seems like Petrov is trying to control this game as much as humanly possible. We end up having Aurora, who ends up seeing that the gold team is kind of being kind of secretive and having some kind of silver things that are supposed to hold on to this rollerball, but are actually also designed to cut some of the other players, like in the face or whatever, just start to like almost kind of stab them in some ways. So we have it to where Aurora eventually is to scramble to get onto the rink or whatever, the field, to be able to tell Jonathan that they are trying to kill him. We end up having Aurora and Jonathan who are trying to look like they're wrestling one another, but in all actuality, Aurora is trying to tell Jonathan that they are trying to kill him. And we end up having Jonathan who is telling Aurora she needs to get off the rink. She needs to get off the field, or otherwise she is going to die for sure. So we end up having it to where it seems like an all-out brawl, and so we ended up having it to where it seems that at first, like, we end up having the red team who is kind of clearing house, but eventually once there is a no-holds-barred kind of rule thing going on, all heck ends up breaking loose. People are starting to get stabbed and killed and hurt and really jostle around. So we eventually end up having it to where Jonathan is barely hanging on. And so we end up having Jonathan, who is desperately demanding a lot of his other players to try and get off the ring, to try to get off the field, because he doesn't want to see them get hurt. And so we end up eventually having a lot of the team going off the field, and there are some gold members that are also just like, dude, I'm not going out there. Like, I'm not going to go out there to die. Like, no, I'm peacing out. So we eventually have it to where Jonathan is to go and fight off any last remaining gold team members that are going to be willing to go out there to kill or whatever. And so we end up having Jonathan, who ends up just basically like having a punching match with one of these gold team members, but eventually he ends up taking them out. And so we eventually have it to where Jonathan goes on to eventually get the ball, and eventually we have it to where it seems that at first we are to think that Jonathan is to try to just score a goal so that way they can win, but no. And also we end up having Petrov and his investor, who is Sanjay, who is to eventually try and desperately get them to cut the feed of this match because it's getting too gory, too gruesome. If anything, they'll lose all their sponsorship, they'll lose everything. And so we eventually have it to where Jonathan eventually we are to assume, score a goal, but instead we end up having Jonathan trying to get enough speed to eventually have him flying through the owner's box seat, to where we eventually have it to where Jonathan is trying to tear through a lot of Petrov's men, and then eventually Jonathan is to make his way to Petrov himself. Eventually, we end up having Jonathan, who ends up taking some items to where he's trying to defend himself and find ways to kill people with whatever he can. So we end up having eventually Petrov, who is desperately trying to take some shotgun cabinet and try to get one of these shotguns out of this cabinet, and we end up having Petrov, who ends up trying to load this shotgun and break off this shotgun to try to shoot, of course, Jonathan with it. Petrov misses, and then Jonathan goes and tries to basically beat Petrov to death. So we end up having Sanjay, who ends up mentioning to Jonathan, it's like, well, hey, like, you want to know the reason why Petrov wasn't able to get that shotgun out of this case? Because I was the one with the keys. I locked it up. And so we end up having it to be that Sanjay is going to now be the new owner of this team. And we end up having it to where really Sanjay is also using like his power to basically say, it's like, well, yeah, like, I'm your new owner, like, you are now mine, kind of thing. And really, you have to lick my boots. And Jonathan is like, well, that's just telling me that I need to do one more thing. And Sanjay's like, what? And so we end up having Jonathan, who ends up cocking the shotgun and firing upon Sanjay and killing him. So we end up having it to where everybody is to be carted off. Everybody is to be getting their way out of here. It seems that there is a riot going on within the city because it seems that Jonathan is to be seen as their hero, and it seems that he had started something, a rebellion, or whatever. Because eventually we end up having one of the characters called Denikin, who is to go and tell people in the audience that they are trying to forcibly spill blood for money, and we eventually have Denikin, who is pulled off from where he's at, eventually is to be shot by some police officer. And eventually we end up having Denikin's brother, who is the guy who is to be a miner, who is eventually going up against Petrov and his men to eventually say that, like, Jonathan is their hero, and they are going to try and resist against Petrov's men and whatever. Which ultimately starts a riot in this arena, and eventually starts a riot in this place, to where eventually we end up seeing Jonathan, seeing everybody rising up because of what Jonathan had done, because they are seeing him as their hero. So, yeah, with that basically said, that is the way of which that this movie tends to end. And so, really, it's a fairly good film. I enjoy it, but other than that, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.